Hi friends, my name is Bhavya Mangla. I am working with DNVGL. So today I am going to talk about a very interesting topic, that is acceptance criteria. Now if you look at ISO 9001 and IATF 16949, you will just find at two places this particular word is coming, acceptance criteria. But when you go in deep, you will realize that the entire organization cannot work without identifying the acceptance criteria and then working on the acceptance criteria and making sure that whether acceptance criteria is being effectively implemented or not. So in this video, I'm going to tell about the acceptance criteria in 7 different steps. And those steps are: who will decide acceptance criteria, why we need to describe the acceptance criteria, at what stage we need to decide the acceptance criteria, what are the different levels or processes where acceptance criteria has to be decided, what are the different traits which tells that whether acceptance criteria is effective or not. The next and the most important is what are the different kind of acceptance criteria which organization has at different stages. And finally, how to gauge that whether acceptance criteria are serving the purpose to the organization or not. So let me start with the first one. Who will decide? So quite logically, it is a cross-functional team that will do it, and that will include the people from design, production, purchase, supply, maybe the suppliers, sometimes customers, and they can brainstorm and then they can decide what kind of acceptance criteria that should be there. Now the point number 2 is that why we need acceptance criteria. So there can be two specific things. One is to avoid any ambiguity, and secondly to define a certain scope under which an organization has to work. Now to talk about point number 1 about ambiguity, now different people can have a different perspective about a particular thing. So for example, there's a metallic component. So one operator can have a perspective that this color shade is good. Maybe another person can have a different perspective. If we talk to the supplier, they may have a different perspective, and customer may have an entirely different perspective. So to avoid any ambiguity, it is better to have one reference sample or one master, so that everybody knows that yes, this is a certain guideline under which we need to work. The second point is to define the scope. Now, different people can think differently about the same thing. So avoid any confusion, it is better to have an acceptance criteria so that all the relevant interstate parties are clear that, well, this is the acceptance criteria and they need to follow only this acceptance criteria. So that brings point number 3, that what are the different stages when organization can define acceptance criteria. So those stages can be new product development, when any major rejection comes, maybe some recall or warranty is there, maybe when internal rejection is increasing, or maybe when the organization feels that the cost of poor quality is going high, so that can be a reason to review into the acceptance criteria. Now that brings point number 4, that how the organization decide that what are the different stages where acceptance criteria needs to be defined. So if you see, all the processes in the organization requires the acceptance criteria, starting from new product development, maybe criteria for incoming inspection, in-process inspection, final inspection, deciding about the laboratory guidelines for internal and external guidelines, how to say that whether internal audit is effective or not, how to decide in HR process that whatever interview that you are taking, whether that person is fit for that job. So each and every process has some acceptance criteria which is relevant. So that brings point number 5. So that point is with respect to that, what are the different possible acceptance criteria that organization can have. So let me share some examples. So in MSA study, measurement system analysis, in R&R, there are certain guidelines that if it is between 0 to 10%, 10 to 30%, and more than 30%. So these are specific acceptance criteria which will decide whether to accept the instrument or not. In SPC study, CPK and PPK guidelines are there, 1.33, 1.67, which are the acceptance criteria. When we talk about new product development, so there are 3 different stages: prototype, pre-launch, and production. So these 3 are also different stages where an organization and customer decide whether the product which is being developed, whether it is fulfilling the guideline as per the expectation of the customer or not. Similarly, if you go further for incoming inspection, the standard has defined many different acceptance criteria, like the supplier can just give the material and organization will check it as per their checklist and then they can accept it. Maybe a third party inspection report will also work. Maybe a second party or third party audit will also serve the purpose for incoming inspection, or maybe a statistical study can also decide whether that product should be accepted or not. Similarly, for calibration, when an organization is thinking that a slip gauge which has to be used as a master, whether it should be 0 grade or 1 grade, organization can decide about it, that yes, this is my acceptance criteria based on the kind of tolerances or variation that they are having in their processes. Similarly, for internal laboratory and external laboratory qualification, standard ISO 17025 becomes as sort of an acceptance criteria for the organization. If you go a little bit more further, for internal audit, which is generally of 3 types: system, process and product, there are certain acceptance criteria that who can do the audit, what will be the competency required, so that becomes the acceptance criteria. Similarly, if you talk about HR process, when they are recruiting a person, the acceptance criteria can be related to type of education, skill and experience that person is having, and based on that they can decide whether to pick that person or not. So if you look at in an organization, each and every process has got some acceptance criteria. Even it is for the non-conforming product also, that in case a product is non-conforming, how you can decide the acceptance criteria. Okay, that much is acceptable, may be used in this particular process but cannot be used in this process. You can repair it or you can rework it. You need to communicate to the customer. So all these things become a part of acceptance criteria. So the next point is, what are the traits of a good acceptance criteria? So acceptance criteria is considered to be good if it is simple. It means people can understand, especially the operators who are working on the shop floor. It is easy for them to understand that yes, whether this acceptance criteria is required or not required, or whether it serves the purpose or not. Then it should be easy to understand to each and every person. There should not be any ambiguity. There should not be any difference of opinion that yes, whether this acceptance criteria is correct or it is not correct. Say for example, there is an acceptance criteria that for welding, the operator should have level 1. So whether it is clearly defined or not. Then another important thing is whether it is serving the purpose. Serving the purpose in a sense that whether customer is satisfied with the organization, whether the rejections are reducing, cost of poor quality is reducing, employee satisfaction is improving. So these are some other traits which reflects that whether acceptance criteria is actually working for the organization or not. So if I summarize everything, I talked about who will decide about the acceptance criteria, when organization has to decide of the acceptance criteria, why organization has to decide the acceptance criteria, what are the different stages in which acceptance criteria has to be decided, what are the different type of acceptance criteria, and finally, what are the different traits which are required to show that whether acceptance criteria are working or not. In case you want to know about this in more detail, you can go to the below link and you will find this information in more detail. And if you want to get these kind of videos regularly, so you can subscribe to my YouTube channel and you will get this updated information regularly. Thank you.